Hello, everyone.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here in this pavilion and literally to be in the midst of many different voices that seem to be. Vijay, it's wonderful to have you here and to be in conversation with you. Uh, can I? Shall we just plunge into this by thinking about this question of language, which is such a it is our key and only medium as poets.
Sure.
And you once said to me in a conversation we had that you see yourself in a tradition that begins with Wordsworth, with the everydayness of language.
Right.
And yet, when I think of many of the poems that you've developed in recent years, you push the limits of the everydayness of language. Some of that everydayness was the everydayness of the King James Version.
Mm-hmm.
You draw on many different starting points of linguistic practice. So could I draw you out on how this plays out for you? Your linguistic sources, what kinds of different languages actually make up the English that you write in?
I mean, it's kind of the endless question, and it's sort of it's not just the endless question of poetry, it's sort of, I think, the endless question of the self. And Wordsworth famously says that his poems are written in the language of ordinary men. And the language of ordinary men becomes sort of a shibboleth of modernity in some way. And but when you look at it, when you think about what the language of ordinary men is, it's not at all clear what the language of ordinary men is, because it's not at all clear what an ordinary man is. And so it's a kind of bait and switch with Wordsworth, but it has an important quality that everybody has pursued since Wordsworth in the writing of English. And all sorts of people who didn't write in English. And, the great Urdu critic Hali, for example, when he was talking about poetry. And, in the aftermath of 1857, when he retreated to Lahore, he was saying that we had to write in our contemporary Urdu idiom, and we had to write about nature. And he got that right from Wordsworth, right? And but that poses this incredibly complicated problem for anybody who writes poetry and anybody who writes anything that is in which the language is conscious of itself. It's aware of itself as language, and that becomes a part of the enterprise of the writing, whether it's prose or poetry. And I think that's been a kind of great quest. And we were talking about this backstage, and I was saying to you, and I'll say it here, that modernity in writing, whether it's English writing, Irish writing, American writing, and presumably writing in Indian vernaculars, is sort of an attempt to write in the language of ordinary men while still maintaining the prerogatives of this art as a high art, as an art that's in some sense hierarchically defined. So it's sacred speech in the language of ordinary men, which is an incredibly difficult problem to master.
Would you think it's even more difficult today in an age that's characterized by the debasement of language through the workings of a populist democracy? It troubles me to link these two terms, populist and democracy, but this is the shape
Sure.
of collective action around the world today.
Sure.
Where do you see the space, if you will, for a poet today? Because at similar moments in history, at such junctures, some poets have been able to voice that sense of a popular churning. I'm thinking of Ghalib, for instance, who you've worked on. Thinking of Mir.
Sure.
You've engaged deeply with the Urdu tradition. At various points, the unrest, the churning, the political strife of a particular moment has borne fruit through these poets.
Sure. Yeah.
Would you see the present through a similar kind of optic, or do you think that poets today are somehow set apart from the action, partly as a result of their professional location? Could I invite you to think about your own situation as an American poet working within academia?
Yeah, this is a tension in poetry in America that's very, very strong. And it's a tension in society in America. And I'm sure it's a tension here. It certainly is historically a tension. And I don't know enough about, say, the Hindi canon or, the Kannada canon to make any judgments about what happens here. But, I think these kind of tensions in language mirror tensions in society. I would say as a poet, who regards language as primary, language as constitutive of human experience, that, what we say and what we say to ourselves determines all of our social relations and all of our intellectual relations, that language is prior, that it's determinative rather than kind of consequent. It's not a consequence, the language we use, but it is the cause of the consequences in society. And a degraded language is something the poets have always been concerned about, and they've been concerned about it in terms of their own responsibility as people who live in the world. And I think any poet who is worth his or her salt, his, her, or their salt, is someone who's living in the time that they are in and responding in some way to their time and insisting in some way in the purification of their language in relationship to their time. So they're constantly at odds with their time because, language is always being debased, and it's not merely, there are kind of invidious debasements of language that have to do with political purposes and political rhetoric, but there's always the underlying debasement of language, which involves using language, understanding language only for the sake of its instrumentality, right? Rather than thinking about language as a living thing, as a living organism that has to be celebrated and protected for its own sake, because of its beauty and its extraordinary qualities. And, and all the different languages have amazing qualities. And it seems like in India, this should be more deeply appreciated than anywhere else, because this is the richest linguistic terrain in the world. I mean, think about it. I mean, how many languages and how many people speak different languages here and code switch from one to the other. So you would think that here the consciousness of language and the love of language for its own sake, which is what drives poetry, is something that would kind of dominate things in some way. And a lot of sociologists talk about India in terms of language wars and stuff like that. And there are ways in which language wars are really kind of wonderful because, they're, if you're fighting with someone over usage, and if you're fighting with someone over kind of, whether you can use language baroquely or you should use language plainly, that seems very, very healthy. I've, heard stories about how in the 18th century in Lucknow, the shagirds of one poet or another would meet in the alleys and they would fight, over the reputation of their ustads, and you know, and I kind of think that's wonderful. That's much better than the kind of fighting that takes place over, you know, all these other ridiculous things. You know?
Yeah,
I mean, I would fight over idiomatic language and usage and stuff like that. You know?
But the tragedy is that the kind of language wars we're fighting today are wars that emanate from the fact that you take language as a basis of your hard-edged identity. It's completely different from the 18th century, where you had polyglot subjectivities. You had people who wrote in Persian and in Braj, something that we're all busy forgetting or being induced to forget. Members of the Mughal court, rulers, aristocrats, who wrote in Persian but also Braj. Braj poets who migrated to the Maratha kingdom, to the Deccan, to Hyderabad, to Tanjore. So these were people who had a kind of pan-South Asian presence and mobility, which is impossible to think of today because we've trapped ourselves in notions of a linguistic region. So I'm wondering how this linguistic reality maps out for you as someone who left India at age 5. Then you grew up and you've effectively made your way and made your career in an American context. How do you, in your work, reclaim these other traditions and contexts and situations that are available to you? Has that become more and more important for you in recent years?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. You know, I mean, one of the complications in that question is that it doesn't acknowledge a transformation that has taken place with a lot of people in India and a lot of people in the Indian diaspora, which is that our consciousness has been filtered through the phenomenon of Western science. So in some sense, it isn't simple to say that I have access to this culture. You know, my father and my mother were both scientists, Indian scientists, and they became a part of a global scientific community. And it's out of that global scientific community that in some sense I developed my identity. So my relationship to India is doubly complicated in that way. But sort of returning to this linguistic medium and finding myself in its richness and its complexity, I notice one important difference in myself. I don't have a problematic relationship to English. No. And I think that if you are an Indian in India as opposed to an Indian in the Indian diaspora, you inevitably have a problematic relationship to English. You can never really, you know, your writing would have to come out of that recognition of a serious division in yourself between the traditional languages of your community and, you know, what is essentially the universal language of India, which is English. You know, I mean, I think that's controversial and might get me in trouble, but, you know, I'm going to go back to New York tomorrow, so, you know, you won't be able to get me unless you hurry very quickly, you know, sort of. But that really does seem to be sort of something about, and which is not to say that there are not great writers of English in India. There are. I mean, in fact, you know, the quality of prose in English prose in India is much higher, I think, than it is in America. And there's sort of an extraordinary capacity of Indians who speak many languages and also speak English to speak beautifully. They're remarkably articulate and they have a broad lexical range, which is something you don't find in American speech. American speech is narrowed and narrowed and narrowed in its lexical range. And it's simplified in a way that you don't see in Indian English writing, where there's a real capacity to kind of manipulate all of the aspects of of English syntax and English vocabulary. So, but nevertheless, I think it's a more problematic thing here than it would be in America, and certainly it is more problematic than it is for me. I'm very comfortable with American English. I mean, American English is sort of inalienable to me. I mean, there is some Kannada deep in the background. As I'm falling asleep, I can hear myself reciting the multiplication tables in Kannada. So there is this stratum there. And at some point I'm going to come here and excavate it, but other than that, and that, but I think, I'm waiting for something extraordinary to come out of Indian poetry, something kind of unimaginable that poetry hasn't discovered yet, and that it will discover arising out of this incredible melange of languages that one finds in this country, and and degrees of complexity, and sort of, and I think we've seen that a lot in various writings, kind of trying to find textures across languages, and I think that's going to continue. I mean, there are a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, because your trope of the language wars is something I'd hold on to, because it seems to me that for the last century and a half or so, the way in which Anglophone poetry in India has developed has been essentially quite defensive. Mm-hmm. It's had to define its ground against claims that it's fundamentally illegitimate, or that it's a vestige of colonial culture, and so on and so forth. It seems to me that Anglophone Indian poets have really not been able to give themselves the freedom to experiment in this translinguistic way. Just to throw another set of ideas into this discussion, I've always found very productive Sheldon Pollock's idea that the idea of the mother tongue, there's no word, that concept does not exist in India before the encounter with European Romanticism. Uh-huh. So in many ways, we are held hostage by things that emerged from essentially a Central European Romanticism, whether it's the nation, or the idea of the folk, a certain originary concept of the people, or the notion of the mother tongue. Uh-huh. And Pollock points out that India's linguistic reality for millennia has been that people had multiple first language capabilities. Sure. So it seems to me that what you're talking about here is looking forward to a time when we give up on this kind of defensive Anglophony versus other kinds of languages. Sure. Sure. And as you say, that has never been a problem for you. But what was it then that, let's say, attracted you to the Urdu tradition? Because you spent a fair amount of time working on Ghalib. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I still read the Divan, and I still read Mir. And what I love about that tradition is its geometry, like the great geometric purity of the Ghazal, and within such a small, like what they call the zameen, the ground of the sher, with its strict regulation, there's so much fluidity and flexibility and expressiveness that is derived just from syntactic variation. It's an incredibly subtle and sophisticated art. And of course it goes back to pre-Islamic Arabia. I mean, it's a continuous tradition from pre-Islamic Arabia basically to the Indian Rebellion, I mean, which is extraordinary. And it's pan-national, and it extends across various languages. And so I always thought that was really beautiful. I mean, the reason it was sort of fraudulent on my part to tell the people at Columbia who gave me fellowships in their PhD program to
that I was going to study the ghazal with, because basically what I was interested in was politics and partition and the history of Islam in India, and what happened to me, I eventually abandoned my interest in that because it was just too monumental and too tragic. And I said, oh, I can just go back and be an American. Why should I deal with this, this terrible violence and stuff? And, but that has allowed me to it allowed me to really learn this tradition. And enough so that I can appreciate it aesthetically. And the contract I had with the people at Columbia when I was studying the ghazal was that I was going to translate. And I've worked on translations, and I have a bunch of sort of ghazals that I've done, and I've been thinking about doing 50 of Ghalib's. And they're not, the scholars I know tend to think of them as transcreations rather than translations.
You think of Francis Pritchett particularly, or other? Have you discussed this with? Because there's a very strong antipathy towards the possibility of translating Ghalib by Francis Pritchett, who's done monumental, seminal work on putting the poetry out.
Sure. Yeah, Francis Pritchett was my Urdu teacher, and she won't call my versions translations. She calls them transliterations, But then, I show her a version by Wyatt of Petrarch and say, or the 23rd Psalm, and I say, well, I'm not straying any farther than these people have strayed, and these translations are a part of, the Western tradition. But she won't accept that argument. But she likes them. She puts them on her website, and so I might continue that. I mean, the interesting thing about translating and the interesting thing about reading in other languages is that it brings up the question of what exactly is the heart of the poem. And for me, translating Ghalib is always translating the person, getting the person on the page rather than the text. And I think that's an endless debate that you can have, because, what is a poem essentially but the creation of another self on the page? And for me, the duty of a translator is to put the reader of English into touch with that person in all of his complexity. And I think I do a fairly good job of that, Mirza Ghalib has been translated very, very badly into English. It's really surprising how bad the translations are. And I don't quite understand why they should be so bad, because so many people have tried to do it.
At least partly because they start out with an imperative that you can't meet.
Right.
And the fact is that the syntax of Urdu allows you to read each line potentially in different ways.
Sure.
So how do you tease out that multiplicity of meaning? How do you present it? Because the syntax of English forces you into one or two alternatives, where the original could actually go 4 different ways, as you well know. But this leads me to something else, Vijay, and it connects with what you were saying. I don't want to put you into this position of having to judge on how far Anglophone poetry in India has got. But I've been troubled for many years by the fact that the preferred form in Anglophone poetry here is a certain kind of short lyric. Not everybody, but that's the prevailing form. It seems as though the capaciousness of poetry is not explored. I mean, and this is an artisanal question. I mean, there are very many things that the poem can do. And you've demonstrated that in amazing ways. The Long Meadow, for instance, was a memoir. So could I draw you out on this question of using poetry as a kind of lever to prize up these many other literary projects? It could serve as a memoir, could serve as an anthropological inquiry. There are very many things it could do, but some of us choose to do very little with it, and that might be a problem.
Yeah, I think the phenomenon itself is sort of transcultural in that there's a sort of specialization that people undergo, and but the real, when things are vital in a poetic culture, people acquire a certain skill and then apply it to an enormous variety of subjects, and they don't take form that seriously, right? Because there's something under form that is really the heart of the poem, you know? So you have, for example, with the Romans, you have philosophical poems like Lucretius, you know? You have narrative poems. You have, you know, Horace's Ars Poetica. And you have Catullus. I mean, what is Catullus? I mean, that kind of... and that sort of vitality, I think, is very much in evidence, or was in evidence in the last generation of American poets. And I think it will come to be in evidence here. You know? I mean, I think Anglophone poetry in India has had kind of to gather itself against forces that are inimical to it. As you were saying, I mean, I'm sure many people in the audience know Mina Alexander, and she was telling me just a few weeks ago that when she was first here, she lives in New York now, and she's someone who was decentered in her linguistic affiliations and allegiances. She's Malayali, but she was raised in North India and in an English and Hindi environment. She went to Egypt, where she wound up in a French environment, and she mastered, you know, French. And in fact, you know, her husband, David Lelyville, told me that when he met her, her French was better than her English, you know. And so she eventually wound up writing in English and being an English poet. But she was telling me that when she was reading, when she was in India, she went to America as an adult, well into her adulthood. But when she would be reading her poems in India, she would always have to confront people who were saying, "Why are you writing in English? You know, you should be writing in, I don't know, I mean, you know, what language, what other language would she choose, right?" Because it wasn't like she grew up in a Malayali environment. She grew up in a sort of trans-Indian environment where there were many languages she could choose from. But, you know, she got her education in English. She went to English medium schools. She, you know, moved to America, so it was sort of inevitable. And that kind of, I don't remember what the point I was going to make about that was, but, you know, it's a complicated terrain for the Anglophone Indian poet to have to deal with these deep issues of language, you know. And I don't think the prose writers have the same problem because they are really dealing with a marketplace, right? And there's a substantial marketplace for English prose in India. But we are not, as poets, market-driven people. I mean, we would love to be market-driven people, right? We would love to have a market to drive our wares to and sell them, but there is no market. I mean, we just, you know, we have to do it for the love of the art because there's no other alternative. You know, so.
And yet there's always a sense that you have to turn to the audience. There is a sense of wanting a dialogue with the audience.
Yeah.
And what seems to be absent or weak there is the sense of shared criteria.
Yeah.
To take forward what you said, the deeper you go into your own struggle with language, the more likely you are to alienate potential readers.
Sure.
Or provoke them in some way. How do poets and audiences work their way to some kind of shared criteria today?
Yeah.
I mean, is that even possible?
Yeah. I think it's difficult, more difficult than it's ever been. But I almost feel like the survival of our, not just our poetic culture, but our culture generally depends upon our capacity to solve that problem. You know, that the problem in poetry synecdochally represents that problem as it exists in society. And the idea that we can't invent new criteria. We can alter the criteria we have to deal with our times, and we can try to build a consensus around that criteria. And that's proved to be incredibly difficult, but it's a task that nobody can shirk. It's a task that's almost essential. And it's very, very important for poetry, especially, in my case, I tend to be very much an elitist when it comes to literature, and very much an elitist of the European-American variety. And in my politics, I, tend to be very much a Democrat and kind of a belief, someone who believes in, a radical inclusiveness. So those things directly contradict each other, and they create a tremendous tension inside myself. And negotiating that tension is really important. But I also feel like both things are very important to me. I mean, my idea of a poet is Wallace Stevens or Paul Valery, and who are difficult poets, or John Ashbery, who people don't read because they feel that the work is inaccessible. But I think everybody should kind of rise to the level of that work, because it's the embodiment of the language that we use in America or in Europe at its deepest. And so, that kind of thing, those kind of conflicts are everywhere in our society right now. I've been going to a lot of the panels, and a lot of them have to do with the political crisis that we're facing. And people are saying very interesting things, political scientists and journalists, and it's fascinating to hear. But I think poets have something to contribute to this discussion too, and it's sort of in a healthy kind of poetic environment, poets are engaged in polemics. They're engaged in polemics, and they feel that what they have to say is something that people should hear. I mean, when Wordsworth was talking about the language of ordinary men, he wasn't talking about just poetry. He was talking about the French Revolution. He was talking about this tremendous transformation in our idea of what the worth and value of a human being was. His thinking was metaphorical. It was synecdochal. The language of ordinary men represented an ethos that everybody should embrace. That we share this common humanity, and it's invested most deeply in language, in the language that we speak, and and that universality. So I think we have something to say. Nobody wants to listen to us, but we nevertheless have something to say.
We have about 6 or 7 minutes for questions that...
Yeah. Any questions?
People who've been listening to us might have. Yeah. For you, Vijay. Is there a mic that can travel or something?
See any hands going up? Questions? Anybody?
Two hands at the back.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. So I was thinking about additions to language, word additions and such. Like Shakespeare added so many different words.
Yeah.
Do you think the word additions that are happening now, at least the ones that are popular, come from a lot of social media words, right? I mean, unfriend became popular last
Right.
year or so.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but is there still a litany of words that get added from poets and such, or is it totally been co-opted by social media? Do you think?
Yeah, I don't see that kind of new word formation in the poetry that I read. Like, what Shakespeare, the new words he added, had to do a lot with his using one part of speech as another. He would turn a noun into a verb and stuff like that, and he would turn verbs into nouns, and that sort of stuff, that kind of linguistic inventiveness is not really that evident in American poetry. And I guess it does occur on the fringes, what I would consider the fringes of poetry, which is social media and I always used to, and I guess I was sufficiently orthodox that I always found things like that appalling, like to turn the word friend into a verb, to friend someone. I was going, oh God, are we really going to go down this road? And, but then we're way down that road now, and I use it. I mean, it's amazing how quickly you can get corrupted by this stuff or unfriend someone. Yeah. I don't use it in speech. I don't go up to someone that I'm mad at and say, I'm going to unfriend you, but I do unfriend, yeah. So, yeah. I mean, I don't know, and I don't know, it might be happening in the Indian vernaculars. I mean, it's amazing how naturally, if you watch TV here, people are incorporating English words into the language they're using, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary how the lexical terrain seems to swell. And I think that must be happening between Indian vernaculars, too. That there are many, many sort of... there's a lot of exchange of genetic information between English and Indian languages and between Indian languages. And that's fascinating. I mean, I hope people are studying this and writing dissertations about it, because it's sort of a new form of language formation, and this sort of, yeah. Anybody else?
Okay, there's a question there.
Don't you think that with every epoch in time, the bards, they either change or evolve in the lexicon that they use? For example, we had Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs in the 60s who gave us a new narrative and a new way of looking at the English language. Also, the band Steely Dan, the way they were able to knit words together, it sounded unique at that time, and now it's part of the English lexicon and the American system. So what do you say? How is there an evolutionary process in which the lexicon develops in time?
Yeah, there is an evolutionary process, but do you know this concept in evolutionary theory called punctuated equilibrium? That, evolution doesn't proceed smoothly, that there are periods where there's an extraordinary amount of speciation, and then things settle for a long, long time into a certain stasis and stability, and then there's another extraordinary period of evolutionary development and speciation, and then stasis again. And I think that's what has happened in American poetry anyway. The post-war poets, the poets of the 1950s and 60s, really transformed the art in extraordinary ways. And we're still digesting that. That doesn't mean at all that there aren't great poets now, but they're kind of great poets of a certain normativity that was established by that generation of Allen Ginsberg and the Beats on the one hand, and kind of the free verse Midwestern poets on the other, and the New York school on the other. And all of that stuff has blended, you know, and I think that in order for poetry to continue in any culture, it has to have those periods of punctuated equilibrium, where there's a rapid development of things. And I don't know enough about Indian poetry in English to know if that happened, but I suspect it probably did. Yeah. Or if it isn't, it didn't. It's happening now because of the enormous changes in this society has undergone in the last quarter century.
It's also very staggered punctuation. It's part of the problem that we were also discussing backstage. It's not a coherent culture with the sense of continuity. There are strong ruptures in this tradition.
Yeah.
And we see that increasingly now with a certain shift in generations. On the one hand, it's important to have that kind of sense of a tradition that you're working in, even if you're kicking up against it.
Right.
But to not have that and to think that history begins with you can be debilitating in another way. But this is really another discussion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was there that might be the last hand that goes up. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, this is Akshay. I think last week there was a Sotheby's auction which sold the first AI-related painting. And
right.
What do you think will this also come in with regards to poetry also? Will we see a new T.S. Eliot in a computer program, and will we read poetry like that? And how will it impact poets of the next generation or current poets also?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're talking about the Banksy canvas and the Sotheby's?
No, not the Banksy one. So basically, a computer program analyzed over thousands or million paintings and created a new painting altogether.
Oh, yeah, I haven't heard about this.
Yeah, and that was last week, I guess. So how would that impact poetry and what poets tell normal people like us?
Yeah. I mean, that's already, that kind of, using algorithms to create poetry is sort of pretty commonplace in America. There's this thing called Flarf. Do you know about that? Where you just sort of plug certain terms in and it creates poetry. And there are people who publish books of this, stuff like that. And for me, so far, it hasn't produced anything of that great significance because it seems to be just a technological variation of certain practices that go right back to the 1950s, where there was this, especially John Cage and the poets who followed him, who created random poetry, right? And, used formulas to create poetry. And this was before the computer, but the computer can just, the computer can do other operations that they couldn't do, but the underlying concept was the same, and it still is the same. So it doesn't have, it's not as revolutionary as it seems to me, and not as transformative as it seems. I think what's interesting now in poetry that's new and compelling, the technology can give individual poets access to that they never had, has to do with these developments in audio, and especially the things you can do with podcasts. So you can kind of create your room into a studio and start layering poems in interesting ways. So the performative side of it, I think, is going to grow and grow and be really interesting. The algorithmic side, I don't know. I mean, I can hardly imagine enjoying a poem like that, but then maybe I am obsolete already. but somehow I don't think I'm obsolete. I don't feel obsolescence in myself, you know. I don't feel it, you know. I mean, I feel like, you know, I feel like I'm forever young, you know. I don't like, you know, understand this stuff. But anyway, our time.
That sounds like a fantastic note to go out on.
Okay.
Vijay, thank you so
Time's
much
up.
for this, for the generosity with which you've shared your thoughts and ideas.
Yeah.
And thank you all.
Thank you all.